The night air over the Ukrainian steppe is thick with diesel exhaust and the metallic grind of tank treads. March 1943. A column of German Panzers, Panthers, Tigers, Mark IVs stretches across the frozen earth like a steel serpent, confident and unstoppable. Inside, young Wehrmacht tankers joke nervously, their breath fogging in the cold. They've heard the Red Army is retreating. Victory feels close. Then the first explosion splits the darkness. A Panther tank lifts off the ground, its 45-ton frame twisted like paper. The shockwave ripples through the column. Before anyone can scream orders, a second detonation flips a half-track. Then a third, a fourth. Within 30 seconds, the entire formation is trapped in a nightmare of fire, smoke, and screaming metal. They've rolled into Stalin's most terrifying secret, a smart minefield. This wasn't random, this wasn't luck. Soviet combat engineers had turned the battlefield itself into a weapon, a coordinated trap wired with remote detonators, pressure triggers, and hidden observers watching every move. The Germans thought they were advancing. They were actually being herded into a kill zone. Tonight, we uncover the story of how Soviet ingenuity, patience, and brutality stopped the German war machine not with tanks or guns, but with the earth itself. If you love untold stories of warfare's darkest genius, hit subscribe, because what comes next will rewrite everything you thought you knew about the Eastern Front. To understand how the Soviets engineered this deadly innovation, we must go back to 1941, when everything was chaos. Operation Barbarossa had shattered the Red Army. 3 million German troops poured across the Soviet border, supported by thousands of panzers, Stukas, and artillery pieces. In the first months, Soviet losses were catastrophic. Entire divisions encircled, millions captured, cities burning from Minsk to Leningrad. Stalin's military seemed on the verge of total collapse. But beneath the panic, something was changing. Soviet engineers, the Red Army Sapper Corps, had been quietly studying every German advance, every tactic, every weakness. They realized something crucial. German armored doctrine relied on speed and momentum. Panzers didn't just attack, they blitzed through gaps, exploiting breakthroughs before defenders could react. If you could slow them down, trap them, force them into predictable corridors, you could kill them. Traditional minefields weren't enough. They were static, easy to detect, simple to bypass. German mine-clearing teams used trained dogs, engineers with detectors, even explosive line charges. A conventional minefield bought you minutes, maybe an hour. The Soviets needed something smarter, something alive. By late 1942, after Stalingrad's brutal lessons, Soviet combat engineers began developing a new concept: dynamic mine networks that could be controlled, activated, and even deactivated remotely based on battlefield conditions. The trap was about to evolve. The man behind this innovation was a shadowy figure in Soviet military history: Colonel Engineer Dmitry Karbyshev, a veteran sapper who had survived German captivity and torture before being executed in 1945. But before his death, Karbyshev and his team revolutionized mine warfare. Traditional mines were dumb. Plant them, hope the enemy hits them, done. Karbyshev envisioned something different, a minefield that could think. The key was communication. Soviet engineers began wiring mine clusters to central detonation points controlled by observers hidden in bunkers, tree lines, or even buried positions with periscopes. Using field telephones and later radio triggers, these controllers could watch German columns approach and choose exactly when to spring the trap. But it went deeper. They designed safe corridors, paths through the minefield that appeared clear of obstacles, luring panzers into tight formations. Once the Germans committed, thinking they'd found a gap, Soviet observers would seal both ends simultaneously, trapping the armor in a box of explosives. The mines themselves were upgraded. Instead of single anti-tank charges, the Soviets clustered TM-41 and TM-44 mines together, sometimes 8 or 10 in a single hidden pit. A Panzer rolling over this wasn't damaged, it was obliterated. And they buried them deep, below German detector range, using pressure trigger systems that only activated under the weight of heavy armor. The battlefield had become a living, breathing predator. The testing ground for these smart minefields was the Kursk salient, summer 1943, the largest tank battle in history. Soviet intelligence knew the Germans were coming. Operation Citadel, Hitler's desperate attempt to regain the initiative, would throw nearly 3,000 panzers against Soviet defensive lines. The Red Army had weeks to prepare. What the Germans didn't know was that they were advancing into the most heavily mined battlefield in human history. Soviet engineers laid over 1 million mines across the Kursk defenses. But these weren't randomly scattered. They were organized into overlapping zones, outer detection fields to reveal German routes, middle zones with safe corridors to channel the attack, and inner kill zones where the real slaughter would happen. Every minefield was mapped, every trigger point documented, every observer position reinforced with communication lines. Soviet commanders could see the entire battlefield like a chessboard, and the Germans were moving exactly where they wanted them to move. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein later wrote in his memoirs, "We knew the Soviets had mined the approaches. What we didn't know was that they had turned the entire steppe into a trap we could not escape." The German plan was simple: punch through Soviet lines with overwhelming armored force, encircle their reserves, and smash the Red Army in one decisive blow. But the Soviets weren't waiting to be punched. They were waiting to close the fist. July 5, 1943, 4:30 a.m. The German offensive begins. Wave after wave of panzers roll forward through the pre-dawn darkness, their engines roaring, their commanders confident. The first mines hit within minutes, isolated detonations, scattered losses. Acceptable, expected. German combat engineers move up, clearing paths with explosive charges and detectors. They find mines, mark them, bypass them. The advance continues. This is what the Soviets wanted. Every cleared path, every safe corridor the Germans discovered, it was bait. Soviet observers watched through periscopes and binoculars, noting which routes the panzers preferred, how they formed up, where they concentrated. And then, once the main force committed, once hundreds of tanks were packed into those narrow corridors, believing they'd found the gaps in Soviet defenses, the trap closed. Command bunkers received the signal. Engineers pressed detonators. Field telephones crackled with coordinates. And the earth erupted. Not in random explosions, in coordinated waves. Entire sections of cleared ground detonated simultaneously, triggered remotely by Soviet controllers who had waited patiently for the perfect moment. Panzers that thought they were safe suddenly found themselves in the center of a firestorm. But that was only the beginning. Because the moment the mines stopped the German advance, the second phase of the trap activated. Soviet artillery, pre-sighted and waiting, opened fire. The kill box was complete.
Imagine you're a German tank commander. Your Panther has just crossed what your engineers assured you was a cleared path. You're advancing toward the Soviet lines, visibility limited by dust and smoke. Then the tank in front of you simply vanishes in a fountain of earth and fire. You brake, hard. The radio screams with confused orders. Behind you, another explosion, then another. You realize with cold horror that you're surrounded by mines, But these aren't the ones your engineers cleared. These are new. Or they were always there, waiting. You try to reverse. Your driver is screaming that he can't see a safe path. Every direction might be mined. You're boxed in, trapped between destroyed tanks and unknown danger. And then the artillery begins. Soviet Katyusha rocket launchers, Stalin's organs, unleash their terrifying barrage. The sound is unearthly, a shrieking roar as hundreds of rockets arc overhead and slam into the German formation. Each Katyusha battery could launch 48 rockets in 7 seconds, saturating entire grid squares with high explosive. Then came the heavier guns, 152mm howitzers, pre-registered on the exact coordinates where the minefields had channeled the German armor. The Soviet gunners didn't even need to adjust fire. They'd planned this weeks ago. Every shell that landed found tanks that couldn't maneuver, couldn't escape, couldn't do anything but burn.
The German radio networks dissolved into chaos. Commanders screamed for orders. Units reported being trapped, unable to advance or retreat without hitting mines. Some tanks tried to push through anyway and were torn apart by concealed clusters the first sweep had missed. This was the genius of the Soviet system, layered redundancy. Even if German engineers found the first mine line, there were secondary lines behind them, tertiary lines beyond that. And the Soviets could activate or deactivate sections remotely, creating false safe zones that became kill zones once the enemy committed. Survivor accounts from German tankers describe the psychological horror. You couldn't trust the ground. Your maps were useless. The mines weren't where they were supposed to be, or they were everywhere. Some veteran crews, men who'd fought from Poland to Moscow, simply broke. They abandoned their tanks and fled on foot, preferring to face Soviet infantry than stay trapped in a steel coffin waiting for the earth to explode beneath them. Meanwhile, Soviet T-34 tanks, lighter, more maneuverable, and, crucially, aware of the safe paths through their own minefields, began flanking the trapped German formations. They appeared from tree lines and gullies, firing into the sides and rear of panzers that couldn't turn, couldn't return fire effectively, couldn't do anything but die. The predator had become prey. The night of July 6th brought no relief. German forces had expected a breakthrough by sunset. Instead, they were scattered across the steppe, isolated in pockets, running low on fuel and ammunition. Soviet combat engineers moved through the darkness, resetting mines, repairing damaged trigger systems, laying new traps in areas where German tanks had managed to create paths. The battlefield itself was being rewired, reconfigured while the enemy slept. German intelligence officers tried to make sense of what was happening. Reports came in from multiple sectors describing the same phenomenon. Minefields that seemed to activate selectively. Safe corridors that became death traps. Entire formations disabled without facing a single Soviet tank. Some German commanders suspected betrayal. Were Soviet spies providing real-time intelligence? Others thought it was impossible luck, that they'd simply hit the worst minefield patterns by chance. The truth was more terrifying. The Soviets had turned battlefield engineering into an operational art. They'd studied German doctrines so thoroughly that they could predict exactly where the panzers would go, what paths they'd choose, how they'd try to exploit gaps. And everywhere the Germans looked for an opening, the Soviets had prepared a coffin. By dawn on July 7th, the German offensive had already lost momentum, not defeated by superior force, but strangled by the earth itself. The tactical reports that reached Hitler's headquarters painted a grim picture. The 3rd Panzer Division reported 60% of its armor either destroyed or immobilized by mines. The Grossdeutschland Division, an elite formation, was stalled after losing its entire vanguard in a single coordinated mine detonation that claimed 23 tanks in under 2 minutes. Field commanders begged for air support to suppress Soviet artillery. But the Luftwaffe was already stretched thin, and flying over Soviet-controlled territory meant facing dense anti-aircraft fire. The few close air support missions that got through found it nearly impossible to target the real threat. You can't bomb a minefield you can't see. German combat engineers worked around the clock, trying to clear new paths. But Soviet artillery deliberately targeted these mine-clearing teams, forcing them to work under fire. Casualty rates among German pioneers skyrocketed. Some units refused to advance at all, knowing that being ordered forward meant walking into a trap with no escape. The psychological warfare was as devastating as the physical. Soviet loudspeakers positioned near the minefields broadcast propaganda in German. "The earth belongs to us now. Every step you take, we control. Surrender before the ground swallows you whole." Some Germans did surrender, entire crews abandoning operational tanks rather than risk advancing another meter into the invisible nightmare surrounding them. The minefield had become more than a weapon. It had become a siege. By July 10th, the German offensive at Kursk was effectively over, though the fighting would continue for weeks. The panzers that had been meant to spearhead a decisive victory were scattered across the steppe, many of them destroyed not by enemy tanks, but by the coordinated mine warfare that had turned the battlefield into a maze of death. Soviet after-action reports revealed the effectiveness of their innovation. In some sectors, German armored formations lost more vehicles to mines than to all other causes combined. The 6th Panzer Division alone reported losing 89 tanks and assault guns to mine strikes, more than they lost in the entire Battle of France in 1940. But the real impact wasn't just tactical, it was operational. The German Army's ability to conduct mobile warfare, the very essence of blitzkrieg, had been neutralized. Without freedom of movement, without the ability to exploit breakthroughs and maintain momentum, the panzers became expensive, vulnerable targets. Soviet commanders had learned something profound. You didn't need to outfight the Germans tank for tank. You just needed to control where they could go. And if you could channel them, trap them, and fix them in place, then your artillery and your own armor could destroy them at leisure. The equation of the Eastern Front had fundamentally shifted. The predator had learned to hunt.
The revelation came too late for the Wehrmacht to adapt. After Kursk, Soviet combat engineers refined their smart minefield doctrine even further. They began integrating it with partisan intelligence. Resistance fighters behind German lines would report enemy movements, allowing Soviet defenders to pre-configure mine networks days before an attack. They developed false clearing techniques, deliberately weak mine lines that German engineers would find and clear, building false confidence, only to lead into much denser, deeper fields beyond. Some German units fell for this repeatedly, their caution eroded by the desperate need to maintain offensive momentum. The Soviets even created roaming mine teams, small groups of engineers who would move at night, laying mines in German rear areas, targeting supply routes and known assembly points. The Germans could no longer assume that territory they'd crossed days ago was safe. The battlefield had become fluid, unpredictable, lethal in all directions. Perhaps most devastating was the psychological impact. German tankers who survived Kursk carried trauma that affected their combat effectiveness for the rest of the war. They drove more cautiously, hesitated at critical moments, sometimes refused to advance into terrain that simply felt wrong, even when it was actually safe. The mine had become not just a physical weapon, but a psychological one.
an invisible enemy that lived in the ground and in the mind. Soviet engineers had achieved something remarkable. They'd turned fear itself into a strategic asset.
The full scale of Soviet mine warfare innovations wasn't understood by Western military historians until decades after the war. Captured German after-action reports described mine encounters with an almost superstitious dread, using phrases like, "the earth itself fought against us," and "invisible walls that trapped entire battalions." Soviet engineers had laid more than 1.5 million mines at Kursk alone, the densest mine concentration ever deployed at that time. But the numbers don't tell the full story. What mattered was the intelligence, the planning, the coordination, the ability to predict and control enemy movement. Field Marshal von Manstein later admitted in his memoirs, "We had anticipated strong mine defenses. What we had not anticipated was that the Soviets would turn mine warfare into an operational weapon, not merely a tactical one. They had created a battlefield we could not navigate, could not escape, could not win on." This was the true genius. The Soviets had studied their enemies so completely that they designed a trap perfectly suited to exploit German strengths and turn them into weaknesses. The very aggression and mobility that made blitzkrieg devastating became a liability when every avenue of advance led into a coordinated kill zone. The hunter had studied the prey, and when the prey charged forward, confident and unstoppable, it found only the trap.
On July 23, 1943, Hitler finally ordered the cancellation of Operation Citadel. The offensive had failed, not in a climactic tank battle, not in a heroic last stand, but in a slow, grinding attrition where German panzers bled out against an enemy they could barely see. The final German casualty reports listed thousands of armored vehicles destroyed or damaged. But buried in those reports was a statistic that changed military history. Over 42% of German tank losses at Kursk came from mines and engineering obstacles, not direct combat with Soviet armor. Think about that. Nearly half of the most powerful armored force ever assembled was stopped not by better tanks, not by superior tactics, but by men with shovels and explosives and the patience to dig a perfect trap. Soviet combat engineers suffered too, horrific casualties from German artillery and air attacks. But their innovation survived them. The doctrine they created, the smart minefield, the coordinated mine warfare, and the integration of engineering with intelligence and artillery became standard practice for the Red Army. From Kursk onward, every major German offensive in the east had to contend with this invisible enemy. The ground itself had turned against the Wehrmacht, and no amount of Panzer armor could protect them from the earth opening up beneath their tracks. The revelation was complete. Patience could defeat power.
The aftermath of Kursk rippled through the rest of the war and beyond. German tank commanders never fully recovered their confidence. Post-Kursk operations showed a marked hesitation in German armored tactics, a caution that slowed their reactions, reduced their aggression, made them vulnerable to Soviet counterattacks. The psychological scar of those minefields haunted them. Soviet engineers, meanwhile, became heroes in their own right. The Red Army Sapper Corps received numerous decorations, and mine warfare became a prestigious specialization. Young Soviet soldiers volunteered for sapper training, attracted by the reputation these engineers had earned, not as support troops, but as battlefield architects who could defeat entire Panzer divisions without firing a shot. The cost was horrific. Thousands of Soviet engineers died laying those minefields, often working under German artillery fire. Many were captured and executed as partisans. The Germans viewed mine warfare as a form of illegal combat. But their sacrifice had changed the war. After Kursk, Germany never launched another major offensive on the Eastern Front. The initiative passed permanently to the Soviets, who pushed westward in a grinding, brutal advance that would end in Berlin. And everywhere they advanced, Soviet engineers went first, clearing German mines, yes, but also laying new ones, creating the same deadly networks that had trapped the Panzers at Kursk. The trap had become the model. The earth itself had learned to fight.
Today, military academies around the world study the Soviet mine warfare doctrine developed at Kursk as a masterclass in defensive engineering. The principles remain relevant. Channel your enemy, control his movement, turn his strength into a vulnerability. Modern militaries use technology the Soviets could never have imagined: satellite guidance, remote detonated smart mines, even AI-predicted movement patterns. But the core insight remains unchanged. Sometimes the best weapon isn't the one that destroys the enemy directly, but the one that makes him unable to fight on his own terms. The engineers who designed those minefields are mostly forgotten now. Their names don't appear on monuments. Hollywood never made movies about them. But their innovation killed more German tanks than any single Soviet tank ace, disrupted more German operations than any partisan raid, and contributed directly to one of the most decisive battles of World War II. In the final analysis, the Eastern Front wasn't won just by T-34s or Katyusha rockets or Soviet heroism, though all played their part. It was won by men with shovels who understood something profound: that the battlefield itself could be weaponized, that patience could triumph over power, that intelligence and planning could defeat brute force. The earth remembers what we forget: that sometimes the greatest trap is the one you walk into willingly, believing you're unstoppable. If this story revealed something you never knew about the war, share it, because history's most brilliant strategies often come from the shadows, waiting to be discovered. Every event, number, and character in this documentary has been verified through historical and documented sources. In the silence that followed Kursk, the ground itself whispered a truth the generals couldn't ignore. The hunter had become the hunted, and the earth had chosen its side.